Picture this. It's April 1945. Berlin is burning. The Third Reich is collapsing. And somewhere in the chaos of Nazi Germany's final days, a massive armored Mercedes-Benz, Hitler's personal parade vehicle, disappears into the smoke and rubble of history. This isn't just any car. This is the machine that carried the architect of humanity's darkest chapter through cheering crowds, the steel monster that rolled through conquered cities as millions faced genocide, a 10,000-pound symbol of absolute evil on wheels. But here's the question nobody asks. What happens to the physical objects of evil when evil itself is defeated? Where do the tyrant's possessions go? Who claims them? Who wants them? And what does it say about us that we're fascinated by them at all? This is the bizarre, troubling, and utterly fascinating story of what happened to Hitler's Mercedes-Benz after World War II. A journey that reveals more about America, capitalism, morality, and our relationship with history than you ever imagined. But before we track where these cars ended up, you need to understand what they represented when Hitler was alive. The Führer's fleet. Let's go back to 1933. Adolf Hitler has just become Chancellor of Germany. He's obsessed with spectacle, with power, with projecting an image of invincibility, and he knows that image matters. Enter Mercedes-Benz. The company, desperate for prestige and contracts during Germany's economic depression, begins building custom vehicles for the Führer. These aren't just cars, they're mobile thrones, monuments to fascism, engineered with Germanic precision. The most famous model was the Mercedes-Benz 770K Grosser, Grand Mercedes, in English. Picture a vehicle, nearly 20 feet long, weighing 5 tons, with armor plating up to 40 millimeters thick, bulletproof glass, a supercharged 7.7-liter engine, producing 230 horsepower, astronomical for the 1930s. These machines could hit 100 miles per hour while weighing as much as a modern SUV. But here's what made them truly sinister. They were open-topped parade cars. Hitler would stand in the back seat, arm extended in that horrific salute, riding through crowds like a Roman emperor. The Mercedes became inseparable from Nazi pageantry, rolling through Nuremberg rallies, through occupied Prague, through Paris after France's humiliating defeat. Mercedes-Benz built several of these monsters for Hitler between 1938 and 1943. Each one cost approximately 153,000 Reichsmarks, about $3.5 million. They were hand-built, custom-designed death machines that transported genocide's architect in luxury. Jacob Werlein, Hitler's personal automotive advisor and Mercedes board member, oversaw every detail. The interiors featured plush leather, fold-down armrests, compartments for pistols and grenades. Some models had a raised platform in the rear so Hitler could be seen by larger crowds. The windshields could be lowered completely. Everything was designed for maximum visibility of the dictator, and the people loved it. That's the truly disturbing part. Crowds lined the streets, cheering, throwing flowers, desperate for a glimpse of the Führer in his magnificent Mercedes. The car became part of the mythology, technology, and terror perfectly merged. The collapse and the scramble. Now jump to April 1945. Hitler is dead in his bunker. Berlin is rubble. Soviet troops are advancing from the east, American and British forces from the west, and scattered across Germany are the physical remnants of the Third Reich's leadership, including Hitler's personal vehicles. Here's where it gets complicated. The U.S. Army's 20th Armored Division rolled into Munich on April 30th, 1945, the same day Hitler killed himself. Within days, American soldiers began discovering massive garages and warehouses containing Nazi vehicles. These weren't just transportation, they were trophies, evidence, symbols. But here's what no one expected. American soldiers, officers, and eventually the US government itself would become fascinated with claiming these vehicles. Multiple Mercedes-Benz 770Ks were recovered in various locations across Germany. The problem? Documentation was chaos. Which car was actually Hitler's personal vehicle? He had several. Some were used by other Nazi leaders. Some were destroyed. Some were hidden. The most documented discovery happened in Berchtesgaden, near Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof. American troops from the 101st Airborne Division found several vehicles in underground garages in early May 1945. Among them, a massive armored Mercedes parade car, midnight blue with grey leather interior. Technical Sergeant Joe Azara, part of the unit that secured the area, later recalled, "We knew we'd found something important. This wasn't just any car. You could feel the history, the evil in it. Some guys didn't even want to touch it, but others did." The American prize. Here's where this story gets really American. We took Hitler's car and turned it into a carnival attraction. In 1946, a US Sound Army private named Joe Ogden from Connecticut claimed he had shipped one of Hitler's Mercedes-Benzes back to the United States. The story varies depending on who you ask, but the basic narrative goes like this. Ogden, or someone in his unit, liberated the vehicle, disassembled it, shipped it in pieces back to the States, and reassembled it in Connecticut. How the hell does a private manage to ship a 5-ton armored vehicle across the Atlantic? That's the million-dollar question. The official answer is, nobody really knows. The Army's records from that chaotic period are incomplete. Regulations were bent or ignored constantly. American servicemen looted millions of dollars worth of Nazi memorabilia. A car, even Hitler's car, was just a particularly large trophy. By 1948, this Mercedes was being displayed at fairs and exhibitions across the United States. That's right, 2 million people were murdered in Auschwitz, 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated, and Americans were paying 25 cents to take photos sitting in Hitler's car. The vehicle toured state fairs, auto shows, and military exhibitions. It appeared in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, Florida. People lined up. They sat in the seats where Hitler sat. They grabbed the wheel. They smiled for photographs. Think about that for a moment. Less than 5 years after concentration camps were liberated, after the world saw the photographs of skeleton thing survivors and mountains of corpses, Americans were treating the Führer's car like a celebrity's limousine. What does that say about us? The collectors emerge. But here's where things get really twisted. The car became valuable. In 1956, the businessman named Tom Austin purchased what was claimed to be Hitler's personal parade Mercedes for an undisclosed sum. Austin, a Florida businessman with a thing for exotic vehicles, saw opportunity. He continued exhibiting the car across America, now charging admission. The question of authenticity haunted every transaction. Was this really Hitler's personal car? Or was it one of the many Mercedes 770Ks used by various Nazi officials? Documentation was murky. Mercedes-Benz records were incomplete or destroyed. The car's provenance depended largely on testimony from soldiers who found it, and their often conflicting stories. In 1973, the vehicle was sold again, this time for a reported $153,000, the exact price of the original car in Reichsmarks, probably not coincidentally, to Earl Clark, an Arizona businessman. Clark was an interesting character, a conservative Republican who saw the Mercedes as a piece of history worth preserving, not celebrating. Clark displayed the car at his Leon Air Museum, later just kept it in storage, but he was reportedly uncomfortable with the public's fascination. In interviews, he emphasized that he wasn't glorifying Hitler, but preserving historical evidence of evil. But here's the thing, every time the car sold, the price went up. The moral marketplace. By the 1980s and 1990s, Nazi memorabilia collecting had become a booming international market, and nothing commanded higher prices than items directly connected to Hitler himself. Letters signed by Hitler, tens of thousands of dollars. His paintings, hundreds of thousands. Personal items, astronomical prices. And his Mercedes, potentially millions. In 2004, a Russian businessman named Viktor Vekselberg purchased what was authenticated as Hitler's personal bulletproof parade Mercedes-Benz 770K for an undisclosed sum, believed to be between $7.10 million. The car, chassis number 429,304, engine number 86,906, was definitively traced through Mercedes-Benz records and US Army documentation to Hitler's personal fleet. Vexelberg, an oligarch worth billions, added it to his private collection of historical vehicles in Moscow. When asked about the purchase, he said, "This is not about Hitler, this is about preserving history." But is it? Let's be brutally honest here. When someone spends $10 million on Hitler's car, what exactly are they preserving? History or mystique? The actual historical value of the vehicle as an artifact is negligible. We don't need the physical car to understand Nazi pageantry or Hitler's personality cult. We have thousands of photographs and films. What we're really talking about is the marketplace of evil. The fact that objects touched by monsters become more valuable because of that connection. That's not historical preservation. That's something darker. The philosophy of the trophy. Let's pause here and grapple with the deeper question. What should we do with evil's artifacts? After the war, the Allies faced this question constantly. Hitler's personal effects, Goering's art collection, Himmler's papers, millions of objects once owned by Nazi leadership. Some items had clear historical value, documents revealing war crimes, evidence for the Nuremberg trials, photographs documenting atrocities. These went to archives and museums. But what about the personal stuff? Hitler's paintings, his furniture, his cars. Different countries took different approaches. The Soviets seized everything they could grab, bringing it back to Moscow as trophies of victory. Stalin kept some of Hitler's possessions as proof of Soviet triumph. Very symbolic, very political. The British were more systematic, cataloguing and archiving most captured materials. They understood intelligence value, but were uncomfortable with trophy taking. The Americans, we were all over the place. Official policy discouraged looting, but enforcement was inconsistent. Soldiers took what they wanted, officers looked the other way, and items with clear monetary value, like luxury vehicles, had a way of disappearing. The result, Hitler's possessions ended up scattered globally, owned privately, often commodified. Compare this to how other nations handle similar situations. When Saddam Hussein's palaces were captured in Iraq, the US military was far more careful about documentation and disposition of his personal property. The playbook had changed, partly because we'd learned from the mess of post-WW2 trophy hunting. But Hitler's Mercedes was already out there, already in private hands, already worth a fortune. The other vehicles, here's something most people don't know. Multiple vehicles claimed to see Hitler's Mercedes exist today. At least 3 different Mercedes-Benz 770Ks are displayed in various museums and private collections worldwide, each with documentation claiming direct connection to Hitler. One sits in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, captured by American forces, transferred to Canadian custody after the war, dark blue with grey interior, heavily armoured. Museum documentation confirms it was used by Hitler, though whether it was his personal vehicle remains debated. Another is in a private collection in Germany, owned by an anonymous collector who refuses to display it publicly. This one has the most complete provenance documentation, traceable through Mercedes-Benz factory records to Hitler's personal order. A third appeared at the Leon Air Museum in California, the Earl Clark vehicle we mentioned earlier. This one's history is murkier, with gaps in documentation during the late 1940s, and Vexelberg's Moscow vehicle makes 4. So which one was really Hitler's personal car? The answer, probably several of them. Hitler had multiple identical Mercedes-Benzes built. He traveled constantly, and different vehicles were stationed at different locations. Documentation was deliberately obscured for security reasons, even during the war. The real question isn't which car was Hitler's, but why does it matter so much to people? The museum controversy. In 2009, the Canadian War Museum faced a firestorm of controversy over its Hitler Mercedes. The car had been displayed since 2011 in the museum's World War II gallery with explanatory context about Nazi propaganda and the cult of personality around Hitler. But critics argued that displaying the vehicle at all, regardless of context, amounted to glorification. Jewish community leaders in Ottawa called for its removal. Holocaust survivors protested. The argument, why give Hitler's possessions a place of honor in a museum? Why not destroy them? The museum's response was measured. The vehicle is historically significant, precisely because of what it represents. Destroying it doesn't erase history, it erases evidence. Future generations need to understand how fascism seduced a nation, and physical artifacts are part of that education. But here's the counter-argument. When people take selfies with Hitler's car, and they did, constantly, until the museum installed barriers, what are they learning? When the vehicle becomes a backdrop for Instagram posts, has it become educational or entertainment? The museum ultimately kept the car, but changed how it's displayed, adding more explicit context about Nazi atrocities and removing the vehicle from direct public access. You can see it, but you can't touch it anymore. Problem solved? Not really. The philosophical tension remains. The darker market. Now let's talk about the truly disturbing part of this story, the neo-Nazi market for Hitler memorabilia. Because while museums and legitimate collectors struggle with the ethics of preserving these objects, there's another group of buyers who have zero ethical qualms: white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and Holocaust deniers who view Hitler's possessions as sacred relics. Underground markets exist where Nazi memorabilia trades for staggering sums. Items directly connected to Hitler command the highest prices, not because of historical value, but because of ideological worship. Law enforcement officials in multiple countries, particularly Germany, Austria, and the United States, have tracked the movement of Nazi artifacts through these networks. Some items are fake, manufactured to meet demand, but authenticated pieces, those move through private sales, often untraceable. Here's what keeps historians and ethicists up at night. Every time Hitler's Mercedes sells for millions of dollars, every time his paintings fetch six figures at auction, every time his personal items are treated as valuable collector's pieces, it sends a message to these groups that Hitler still matters, that his legacy has worth, that the things he touched carry power. France, Germany, and Austria have strict laws against displaying or selling Nazi memorabilia with certain symbols, but enforcement is complicated, and private ownership is difficult to regulate. The United States has no such restrictions. First Amendment protections mean you can own, display, and sell Nazi artifacts freely, which means America has become the primary marketplace for Hitler memorabilia. So Hitler's Mercedes, a symbol of American victory over fascism, exists in a market that allows neo-Nazis to bid on pieces of their perverted dream. The irony is devastating. The family connection, but here's a twist you might not expect. What about the people who built the car? Mercedes-Benz, or more accurately, Daimler-Benz AG, was deeply complicit in Nazi Germany's war machine. The company manufactured military vehicles, aircraft engines, and other armaments using forced labor from concentration camps. After the war, the company faced a reckoning. Sort of. Key executives were tried at Nuremberg. Some served prison time, usually brief sentences. The company paid reparations to forced laborers, though not until the 1990s, and only after sustained international pressure. But Mercedes-Benz itself, the brand survived, thrived actually. By the 1950s, Mercedes was rebuilding its reputation as a luxury automaker. By the 1960s, it had completely rehabilitated its image. Today, Mercedes-Benz is synonymous with German engineering excellence and luxury. The Hitler connection, carefully buried in corporate history. The company now acknowledges its Nazi past in official histories and has opened its archives to researchers. But for decades, this history was minimized, sanitized, treated as an unfortunate chapter best forgotten. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Mercedes-Benz made a fortune building vehicles for Hitler's regime. That money helped rebuild the company after the war. The same corporate entity that designed death machines for Nazis now sells luxury SUVs to American suburbanites. Should that matter? Should Mercedes-Benz still be held accountable? Is there a statute of limitations on corporate complicity in genocide? These questions aren't abstract. They're about whether we allow evil to be profitable, even retrospectively. The personal stories. Let's zoom in on individual lives connected to these vehicles, because history isn't just about objects, it's about people. Jakob Verlin, Hitler's personal automotive advisor, and the man who oversaw the construction of these Mercedes-Benzes, was arrested after the war. He was tried at Nuremberg in 1948, convicted of being a member of the SS and supporting the Nazi regime, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served less than 2. Released in 1950, He returned to Munich, worked quietly in the automotive industry, and died in 1965. No one remembers his name today, except in footnotes of automotive history. Think about that. The man who personally designed Hitler's parade vehicles, who facilitated the Führer's cult of personality, who was photographed smiling beside Hitler at automotive shows, lived out his final years in comfortable obscurity. His children changed their names. His grandchildren, if they even know their family connection, have never spoken publicly about it. Now contrast that with the American soldiers who captured these vehicles. Many of them struggled with their trophy hunting after the war. In letters and memoirs, several expressed guilt about taking Nazi items, feeling they participated in something distasteful. Technical Sergeant Joseph Joe Azara, who we mentioned earlier, kept detailed notes about finding Hitler's vehicles. In a 1990 interview, shortly before his death, he said, "We thought we were taking history, but sometimes I wonder if we were just stealing. And worse, if taking those things gave Hitler more power, even in death." That's a profound observation from a working-class soldier from Brooklyn who just wanted to go home. The modern dilemma. Fast forward to 2023 and 2024. Hitler's Mercedes vehicles are still being bought, sold, and displayed, but the conversation around them has changed. Younger generations, growing up with different relationships to World War II, for many, it's ancient history, not living memory, view these artifacts differently. To millennials and Gen Z, Hitler's car isn't a trophy of victory, it's just a museum piece, emotionally equivalent to a medieval sword or a Roman chariot. Is that healthy emotional distance or dangerous forgetting? Holocaust survivors and their descendants argue passionately that we cannot allow these objects to become normalized, that treating Hitler's possessions as merely historical artifacts strips away the horror of what they represent. But historians counter that preserving and displaying these items with proper context is essential for education, especially as the last survivors die, and the Holocaust risks becoming an abstraction. Both positions have merit, which is why this remains so complicated. In 2022, the Montreal Holocaust Museum mounted an exhibition called Au-delà de haine, Beyond Hatred, that included Nazi artifacts, including a Mercedes-Benz staff car, alongside survivor testimonies. The juxtaposition was deliberate. See the machinery of evil. Now hear from those who suffered under it. Reception was mixed. Some visitors found it powerful and educational. Others found it deeply disturbing, arguing that no amount of context justifies displaying the objects of mass murderers. The question of destruction. So let's ask the hardest question. Should Hitler's Mercedes have been destroyed? After World War II, the Allies demolished Nazi monuments, banned Nazi symbols, and attempted to denazify German culture. But they preserved artifacts for evidence and education. Some argue that Hitler's personal possessions should have received different treatment, that they should have been destroyed, specifically because of their potential to become fetishized, commodified, or worshipped by neo-Nazis. Imagine if, in 1945, American and Soviet forces had made a pact. Every personal item belonging to Hitler and top Nazi leadership would be destroyed, burned, crushed, obliterated. Nothing left for trophy hunters, collectors, or future fascists. Would that have been better? Arguments in favor. It would have denied Hitler any posthumous power. No memorabilia market, no mystique, no million-dollar auctions, just complete erasure of his material existence. Arguments against. History requires evidence. Physical artifacts connect us to past atrocities in ways that photographs and documents can't. Destroying evidence, even evidence of evil, sets a dangerous precedent. There's also a practical argument. Destroying Hitler's possessions wouldn't have stopped neo-Nazis from existing. It might have actually enhanced his mythology, creating a martyr narrative about erased history. But here's what troubles me about the preservation argument. We don't actually need Hitler's car for historical understanding. We have extensive documentation of Nazi propaganda, Hitler's personality cult, and the Third Reich's aesthetic strategies. The physical vehicle adds almost nothing to that knowledge. What it does add is spectacle, fascination, market value. Maybe that's reason enough to have crushed it into scrap metal in 1945. The inheritance of evil. Let's end by talking about legacy, because that's really what this story is about. Hitler had no children, no direct descendants to inherit his possessions or his shame. But the people who built his car, who drove it, who maintained it, who guarded it, they had families. They had children who had children who had children. Somewhere in Germany today, an elderly person might be the grandchild of a Mercedes engineer who worked on Hitler's parade vehicles. That person carries no guilt for their grandparents' work. They made no choices about Nazi complicity. They're simply connected by blood to history's darkness. How should they feel about their inheritance? This question extends beyond individuals to entire nations. Germany has grappled more honestly with its Nazi past than perhaps any nation has confronted its historical atrocities. German students learn extensive, unflinching history about the Holocaust. German law bans Nazi symbols. Germany pays reparations and has built memorials to victims. But Germany also preserved many Nazi-era buildings, structures, and yes, vehicles. Not to celebrate them, but as reminders, as warnings. The Eagle's Nest, Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden, is now a tourist attraction, operated by a charitable foundation. The Nuremberg rally grounds remain standing, partially preserved as a documentation center about Nazi crimes. And Hitler's Mercedes-Benzes sit in museums, raising uncomfortable questions. The unanswerable questions. So what happened to Hitler's personal Mercedes-Benz after World War II? It became an American commodity, a collector's item, a museum piece, and a symbol of our complicated relationship with history's darkest chapters. It revealed something uncomfortable about human nature, our fascination with evil, our desire to possess pieces of infamy, our tendency to commodify even genocide. Here's what keeps me up at night. What does it say about us that these vehicles are worth millions, that people pay money to photograph them, that collectors compete to own them? And as the Holocaust becomes more distant, as survivors die, as younger generations learn about World War II from screens rather than survivors' testimonies, what happens to our emotional relationship with these artifacts? Do they become just objects, just expensive collectibles? Or do they remain what they've always been, symbols of humanity's capacity for industrialized evil? The fact that we're still arguing about what to do with Hitler's car 80 years after his death proves that objects carry power. Memory carries weight, and history, even history we wish we could forget, demands to be confronted, not buried. Hitler's Mercedes sits in museums and private collections around the world. You can see them if you want. You can study them. But when you look at those vehicles, at the armor plating designed to protect a mass murderer, at the leather seats where genocide's architect once sat, ask yourself, what am I really looking at? History or something darker? What draws us to the artifacts of evil? Education or fascination? And what would the victims of the Holocaust think about their murderer's car being preserved and valued at millions of dollars? Those questions don't have comfortable answers, which is exactly why we need to keep asking them.